They thought they had caught the mastermind behind the SASSA scheme. But as the handcuffs clicked and the news broke, a darker truth lurked beneath the surface, one that would expose an even bigger, hidden empire. It all began inside a crowded Shoprite store in Soweto. 2 women, a stack of SASSA cards, and a simple tip-off to police. What seemed like a small-time scam unraveled into a nationwide betrayal of trust, involving government officials, fake identities, and millions stolen from South Africa's poorest citizens. Now, with whistleblowers stepping forward and arrests piling up, one question haunts the nation. Who really runs the network? 2 computer science students at Stellenbosch University were working on a project that had nothing to do with crime. Their goal was to test vulnerabilities in public and private systems, not to cause harm, but to help improve security. They chose to start with something simple: the South African Social Security Agency, known as SASSA. At first, it was just numbers, but what they found would shake the entire nation. They began by comparing national birth data with SASSA grant applications. February 2005 stood out. The national records showed just over 82,000 births that month, but the number of grant applications tied to that birth month was nearly 75,000. That meant almost 91% of people born in that month had applied for grants, a number that didn't make any sense. Not every person in South Africa is struggling. Not every 18-year-old qualifies for a grant. These students knew something was wrong. The data wasn't adding up. They couldn't ignore it, so they expanded their investigation. They looked at birth years between 2002 and 2006. They also looked at older generations born between 1960 and 2005. The younger group showed a 90% grant application rate. The older group was less than 50%. That gap was too wide. It didn't follow any logical pattern. Something much bigger was happening. Then things got personal. The students found that SASSA had paid out grants using their own identity numbers. Neither of them had ever applied for a grant. They were shocked. This wasn't just data manipulation. It was full-on identity theft, and it had reached their own records. To see how deep the issue went, they surveyed students on campus. Out of 60 students, 58 had active SASSA grants under their names. But here's the kicker. 56 of them said they never applied for any grant. That was no longer an error. That was mass fraud. Something organized was going on, and it had infiltrated SASSA's system on a national level. The students knew they couldn't keep quiet. They went public with their findings. It didn't take long for the story to spread like wildfire. Major news outlets picked it up. Headlines screamed about massive fraud within one of South Africa's most critical financial systems. As the nation watched in disbelief, the pressure started piling on the government. The Minister of Social Development made a public appearance. She promised the entire country that there would be a full investigation. She gave the team 30 days to uncover the truth. For a moment, people felt hope. The news lit up social media. Radio talk shows buzzed. People wanted answers. They wanted heads to roll. Everyone from taxpayers to grant recipients felt betrayed. But then, silence. Weeks passed. No updates, no arrests, no word from the so-called investigation team. It was like someone had pulled the plug on the case. People started asking questions. Was the investigation really happening, or was it being buried? The minister's promise faded from headlines. Anger turned into frustration. Suspicion grew. Whispers about an inside job started to spread. The students had expected some kind of backlash, but they didn't expect a blackout. Their phones stopped ringing. No one from the government called, and yet they knew what they had seen. The numbers didn't lie. Someone was stealing identities. Someone was cashing in on fake grants, and it wasn't just small-time crooks. This was organized, calculated, and protected. At Stellenbosch, the students kept digging. They wanted to know how deep this thing went. If their own IDs had been used, how many others had suffered the same fate? They reached out to peers, lecturers, even journalists. They weren't letting it go. And neither was the public. Even with no word from the authorities, people began to connect the dots. Fake applications, duplicate payouts, stolen identities. Everything pointed to a major breach inside the system, but no one was being held accountable. And the silence from officials only made it worse. This was not a glitch. It was a syndicate, one so bold it used real people's identities to bleed the country dry and left no visible trail. But the trail was there, buried in data, hidden in systems. And 2 university students had uncovered the first clue in a crime worth millions. It was just a normal afternoon at a Shoprite in Soweto. But what happened next would change the course of a national investigation. Two women strolled into the store and headed straight to the ATMs. They weren't shopping. Instead, they were making back-to-back withdrawals using different SASSA cards. At first, the staff thought little of it until they noticed just how many times the women returned to the machine. The shop workers kept watching. Something was off. The women moved in a pattern, always checking around before they slid in another card. More people gathered near the ATM as the cash started to pour out. In total, the women used more than a dozen different cards in a matter of minutes. That's when one of the workers made a call to the police, but they didn't alert the women. They kept calm, pretending everything was normal. They knew that tipping off the suspects could ruin the chance of catching them in the act. All they had to do now was wait. The police didn't take long. Within minutes, officers entered the store quietly. They moved in fast, blocking off the exits without drawing attention. The two women were still at the ATM, completely unaware that the net was closing in. When they were surrounded, they froze. Police searched them on the spot. What they found was shocking. The women had over 40,000 rands in cash, freshly withdrawn. They also had dozens of SASSA cards, each linked to different identities. No clear explanation, no legal documents to match. Right there, police knew this was no random crime. This wasn't just two people stealing. This had signs of something much bigger, organized fraud, calculated and quiet until now, and they were just getting started. As police escorted the women out of the store, something else caught their eye. A man was waiting in a car nearby. He didn't look surprised when the women were arrested. Instead, he sat still, like he knew the game was over. Officers approached and asked for identification. They searched the man and the evidence piled up quickly. He had a stack of bank cards, more SASSA cards, 5 different passports from multiple countries, and over a dozen SIM cards. They also found photos, identity shots that looked like they were for making fake IDs. This wasn't a minor player. This was a link in a very large chain. When they questioned him, the man didn't resist much. Under pressure, he broke. He said he wasn't acting alone. And that's when the name of an Ethiopian man came up, a person police hadn't even heard of before. But now, he was suddenly the prime target. Police followed the lead straight to the man's location. It was a quiet place in Johannesburg, no signs of movement, but once they got inside, what they found confirmed everything. The Ethiopian man had over 150 SASSA cards, many bank cards, and a loaded, unlicensed firearm hidden under a drawer. He didn't say much, but his silence said enough. The way the cards were stored, the way the IDs were printed, and the way the passports were organized, it all pointed to a planned, professional operation. This wasn't just fraud, it was a network, and it had been operating right under everyone's nose. As they moved through the house, investigators found detailed logs, names, Idaho numbers, grant payment schedules. Everything was recorded with military precision. This wasn't a sloppy scam. It was polished, cold, and organized. The kind of crime that takes time, skill, and connections. Back at the station, authorities began linking the dots. The man caught at Shoprite was no outsider. He worked at SASSA. One of the women was his wife, and now they had access to someone who might be even higher up in the operation. The discovery wasn't just a win. It was the first real breakthrough in a months-long investigation. But even with the arrests, police knew this was just a small piece of something massive. The Ethiopian man was clearly important, but he didn't act alone. There were more people, and somewhere, there was someone pulling the strings. The public didn't know this part yet, but inside the investigation room, it was clear the SASSA fraud was deeper than anyone expected. The syndicate had structure, insiders, and a system that had stolen millions. And it had all started to unravel because 2 women got too greedy, and 1 store worker paid attention. What came next would expose even more. The trail was just beginning to heat up. The arrest of the man at Shoprite revealed a shocking truth no one could have expected. He wasn't just another criminal on the streets. This man worked inside SASSA, the very agency responsible for distributing social grants. What made the situation even worse was that one of the women arrested was his wife. The connection between them opened a dark window into an organized operation that reached deep into the heart of the South African government. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered that the man wasn't working alone. Multiple SASSA employees were involved in the scheme, all playing their part in a massive fraud operation. These insiders had direct access to sensitive data, grant applications, personal details, and everything else needed to exploit the system. They were able to manipulate information, create fake identities, and steal millions without raising suspicion. The betrayal was stunning. Those who were supposed to help the poor had instead turned the system into their own personal cash machine. It wasn't just petty criminals on the streets who were behind the fraud, it went higher up. At the center of this operation was a SASSA manager, someone with authority and a complete understanding of the system's inner workings. This was no simple act of theft. It was a highly organized syndicate with a structure designed for one thing: stealing. They didn't just steal a few rands here and there. They systematically manipulated data, created ghost applicants, and forged identities to get multiple payments for the same person. It wasn't just a crime. It was a complete breakdown of trust. The network was like a well-oiled machine, with every player knowing their role. One person would gather identities, another would forge documents, and yet another would make the withdrawals. They even used real applicants, people who had no idea their identities were being stolen. They duplicated legitimate data to create fake accounts, which allowed the syndicate to collect money over and over again without being noticed. It wasn't just the money that was stolen. It was the integrity of the entire system, one that was supposed to help the most vulnerable people in the country. In SASSA, greed had taken the center stage. People who were supposed to help the public had instead used their jobs to make money at the expense of the people they were supposed to help. The system was supposed to help the poor, but these employees turned it into a way to steal. The effects that followed were terrible. While the thieves spent the money on their fancy lifestyles, thousands of qualified people who were waiting for grants were rejected. The public lost faith in SASSA, and people all over the country felt betrayed. In the first round, arrests happened quickly. 3 people from SASSA were arrested in Johannesburg on March 14th. The police didn't plan to stop there. As the investigation grew, more people were arrested in Soweto, and some members of the crime group voluntarily turned themselves in. This operation was much bigger than anyone thought it would be. Clearly, though, this was just the start, even though people were being arrested. The investigation wasn't even close to being over. There were still more members of the syndicate waiting to be found. The arrests of these SASSA employees shocked the whole country. People who thought the government would take care of them now found that the leaders had taken a different view. One could feel effects that went beyond just the money lost. It hurt the whole welfare system, which had been broken down by greed and corruption. The public's anger grew as they demanded answers. How many more people were there? What length of time had this operation been going on? It was clear that this was a long-standing problem, and more arrests were almost certain. People were getting more and more angry, even though the scandal was just beginning. Every new piece of information found made the corruption worse. The country was waiting for justice to be done while keeping a close eye on things. It was only beginning to become clear that SASSA was cheating, and the full extent of the crime had yet to be found. When researchers linked the fake cards to the stolen grants, financial forensics showed how big the fraud really was. The group stole more than 265 million rands in taxpayer money by using stolen identities to look like real recipients. So, as not to raise any red flags, these funds were taken out 1 month at a time instead of all at once. It looked like the withdrawals were pretty normal because they were in line with what real SASSA recipients do. By following the cards, researchers found out how widespread the fraud was. Every transaction was carefully planned to avoid being caught. Everywhere they went, the gang made false paths to make their plan even harder to follow. They often changed their phone numbers and used several unregistered SIM cards to hide their calls. They also had foreign bank accounts so they could move the stolen money across borders. This makes it almost impossible for South African authorities to find the money. Every move was planned to leave a digital trail that led researchers down the wrong paths. Even with all of these efforts, the syndicate's complicated web of lies was slowly falling apart, but not before it caused frustration and confusion among law enforcement. While the fraud was going on, members of the syndicate lived a showy life, buying expensive things that would get them in trouble if they were ever caught. Millions of rands were stolen, which was used to buy designer goods, homes, cars, and ways of life that didn't seem to fit with the average South Africans. Still, the people in this gang were experts at fitting in. As a way to hide their wealth and avoid drawing attention to themselves, they knew how to cover their tracks. For people who were looking for them, the fact that they could live off of the thefts and stay hidden made things even more frustrating. Part of the reason the syndicate was able to steal so much for so long was the complete failure of government oversight. The systems designed to protect the public from fraud were outdated and ineffective, offering little to no protection against the crime. Real-time fraud detection was a non-existent luxury, leaving the stolen funds to slip through the cracks unnoticed for months. Even the internal audits that should have caught these red flags were either ignored or tampered with, allowing the fraud to continue without interruption. The system, meant to safeguard the most vulnerable, had become a tool for thieves, and the people who trusted it were paying the price. South Africans felt betrayed. The grants that were meant to help the poorest and most vulnerable in society were now being stolen by those who were supposed to protect them. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the trust that had been broken. People who had relied on these grants for food, shelter, and survival found themselves with nothing, while criminals flaunted their wealth. The anger from the public was palpable, and the sense of violation grew stronger each day. The very system meant to provide a safety net had been turned into a corrupt operation for personal gain, and the people were no longer willing to turn a blind eye. As the details of the fraud spread, political fallout was inevitable. The opposition parties were quick to demand full transparency from the government. They called for a thorough investigation and accountability from the Minister of Social Development and the leadership at SASSA. The pressure on the authorities mounted as the public's anger turned into political action. The trust in the government was eroding fast, and there were growing calls for reform in how grants were distributed and monitored. The scandal had reached the highest levels, and the political ramifications were only beginning to unfold. With every passing day, the investigation gained momentum. The people of South Africa demanded justice, but the question remained: how much more of this operation had yet to be uncovered? The syndicate had stolen millions, and the country was watching, hoping for answers. But as the pressure mounted, so did the uncertainty. Would those responsible for this massive betrayal ever be held accountable, or would the fraud continue to go unnoticed in the shadows? The road to uncovering the full scale of the operation had only just begun. The arrest of the Ethiopian man marked a significant turning point in the investigation, but questions lingered. Was he the mastermind behind the operation, or merely a lieutenant in a larger criminal network? While his role seemed central, there was mounting evidence to suggest that he was just one part of a much bigger operation. The passports from multiple countries found on his person hinted at a cross-border operation, perhaps reaching far beyond South Africa's borders. This raised the question of whether the syndicate was merely a local issue or if it had international links that stretched across the globe, adding complexity to an already baffling case. Despite the arrests and the ongoing investigation, much remained hidden. Authorities were quick to seize the physical evidence, but experts suspected there was a crucial digital infrastructure that had not yet been uncovered. This infrastructure could be the key to uncovering the full scale of the fraud operation, linking it to further accomplices and possibly even foreign networks. The authorities were also investigating offshore bank accounts that had been used to launder the stolen funds. With each new lead, the investigation seemed to grow larger, raising more questions than answers, leaving the public on edge about what would be discovered next. As the investigation continued, the pressure on law enforcement mounted. Police were now working closely with Home Affairs and specialized cybercrime units to trace the full extent of the criminal network. These agencies had to work together to uncover the intricate web of fake identities, stolen funds, and illicit international connections. The public, however, was becoming more vocal, demanding that authorities dig deeper and publish their findings in full. Civil society groups rallied, calling for transparency and for law enforcement to leave no stone unturned, as the weight of the scandal only grew heavier with each passing day. Amid the growing pressure, more whistleblowers began to step forward. Internal SASSA employees who had been part of the operation started cooperating with investigators, sharing crucial information that had been hidden for years. Some of these employees had been terrified of speaking out, fearing retaliation or even criminal charges. But with the promise of protection and plea deals, many were now willing to provide vital information about the inner workings of the fraud network. These whistleblowers painted a chilling picture of how deep the corruption ran within the system, revealing that the syndicate's reach was far broader than anyone had anticipated. The future of SASSA and its ability to regain the public's trust was now in question. The government had pledged to overhaul the entire welfare system, introducing stronger fraud prevention measures and more stringent checks. However, this promise was met with skepticism from citizens who were still reeling from the magnitude of the fraud. They demanded audits and transparency and called for arrests at the highest levels, hoping that those responsible would be held accountable, no matter how far up the chain the corruption went. The public's anger was palpable, and the calls for justice grew louder with every new revelation about the scale of the operation. The most pressing question, however, remained unanswered. Who was really behind South Africa's largest welfare fraud scandal? Was it the Ethiopian man, or was there a more elusive mastermind pulling the strings from the shadows? As authorities closed in on the syndicate, the investigation seemed to grow more complex, with each new lead pointing to a larger and more intricate criminal operation. Until the true architect was found and arrested, the country would continue to wait, watching as the authorities chased down leads, piecing together a puzzle that had shattered the lives of so many South Africans. The public's patience was running thin, and the pressure was mounting for justice to be served. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in the next video.